pretty little uniforms or bigger uniforms, depending on the size of the Pathfinder. And I'm just glad to have everybody here this morning. We are continuing our series on the book of Daniel. We are now in Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6. If you would open up your Bibles to Daniel chapter 6, we'll get started here in just a minute. Please remember that starting in the first weekend of October, we'll be starting our Revelation seminar, going through the book of Revelation from chapter 1 to chapter 22. So please plan on being there for that. It's going to be every Friday and Saturday night, so go ahead and clear your schedules from October, I believe, 6th through the 28th or 29th. But every Friday and Saturday night and Sabbath morning, we're going to be going through the book of Daniel. So please keep that in mind, keep that in your calendars, and most importantly, keep that in your prayers. So with that, let's go ahead, if you don't mind, we're going to bow our heads for a word of prayer, and we'll get started. Gracious Father in heaven, Lord, I just thank you so much for this day. I thank you for the opportunity for us to be here this morning, and I thank you for your word. I pray as we get started this morning that you will open up our hearts, you will open up our minds, and that you will guide and direct us into the truth of your word. And I pray, Lord, that as we continue through this study, that we will learn how to be a Daniel ourselves, how to let our lives be one that is distinguished as someone who follows you. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Daniel chapter 6. This is a story that we all know quite well, but we're going to go through it and read through it anyway. So if you've got your Bibles, Daniel chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120... It's on. Can everybody hear me now? Yes. Okay, I don't want to feel like a commercial from the 90s. All right. Somebody got that. Let's start over again. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 strafes to be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, and then the strafes might give an account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and the strafes, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So the governors and the strafes sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault, because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. Then these men said, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel, unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. So these governors and strafes thronged before the king, and said thus to him, King Darius, live forever. All the governors of the kingdom, and the administrators and the strafes, and the counselors and the advisors have counseled together to establish a royal statute to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except for you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter. Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree. And now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room with his window open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day, and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was the custom since his early days. And then these men assembled and focused and found Daniel praying and making supplications before his God. And they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days, except for you, O king, shall be cast into a den of lions? And the king answered and said, the thing is true according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. So they answered and said before the king that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard to you, O king, for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. And the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with him, and he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Then these men approached the king and said to the king, "Know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed." So the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, "Your God whom you serve continually, he will deliver you." Then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signets of his lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel may not be changed. Now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him. Also his sleep went from him. And then the king arose early in the morning and went to haste to the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to deliver you from the lions?" Then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths, so they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you." Now the king was exceedingly glad for him, and commanded that they should take up Daniel out of the den. So that Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he believed in his God. And then the king gave a command, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them with their children and their wives. And the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones into pieces before they even came to the bottom of the den. Then King Darius wrote to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, "Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one that shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian." I love the book of Daniel. I love the stories in the book of Daniel. I love the prophecies in the book of Daniel. It's just so powerful to me to see how God stands for his faithful children. When we are putting our lives into the hands of God, the way that God would have us do it, he will provide. He will take care of us. Many of you guys know Pastor Pablo Goya. He was formerly the pastor of the Lexington Seventh-day Adventist Church, where I spent my first few years in Kentucky serving with him as an associate pastor there. And last year, this previous year at camp meeting, he came by to tell a story to our kindergartners about a mission trip that had just happened. And he was telling about how they had went to Cuba, and he tells the story of Peter. Peter's a friend of mine, and when I hear this story, I can see all the different elements of this story kind of coming together. It was actually quite neat. And they get ready to go to this mission trip in Cuba, and they go and they're getting ready, and they have the different people who are going to be at different sites. Pastor Goya was going to be preaching at one site, Peter at another site, another group of people at another site, and each site had their different people that they had kind of in charge of things. They had Bible workers that would go out and give Bible studies and work with people. They had the people who were going to do the children's story. They had their lodging set up. They had their meals prepared. They had their drivers that was going to take them back and forth. They had all of this planned, and they had the money taken there to be able to provide these services and this ministry to the people in Cuba. Well, they get there, and they found out that right before the meetings happened, that they did not want them there preaching in the place that they had scheduled. And so they're like, well, what do? We don't have a place. And so they go to the different churches asking, can we use your church? No. Can we use your church? No. Can we use your church? No. Can we use this building? No. They kept getting the answer no every way they turned. And finally, one of the local Baptist churches said, yes, you can use our church. It's just going to cost you just a little bit of money. About $2,500. Well, for the set of meetings, they're like, well, what do we do? Peter opened his wallet. He had about $2,600 with him. Now, that was $2,600 to pay for the food, the driver, the Bible workers, the helpers, the lodging. They couldn't survive for 2 weeks on just $100. So he calls Pastor Goya, and he sits there and says, hey, Pastor Goya, what do we do? We don't have the money to do this. There's no money left over. And he says, Peter, have you prayed about this? His actual name is Peter, by the way. It's not just relating to the name because of the biblical character Peter. His name is actually Peter. Have you prayed about this? It's like, well, yeah, of course we prayed. But he's like, no, but have you prayed about this? And he sits there and says, maybe not the way I should. He says, go pray about this. This is God's will. You pay the person for the building, and you preach the gospel. And he's like, well, that's easy for you to say. You're not the one that's only got $2,600, and they're asking to pay $2,500. He goes back, and he prays, and he says, God, this is your work. This is your mission. Can you do something for us? Can you give us something? No answer. So he sat there and said, okay, we're going to give this $2,500 to these people so we can have these meetings. Gives the money, puts his wallet away. They have the meetings for the first night. Not a lot of people show up for the meetings the first night either. And they get back to the hotel, and they're like, well, we've got to pay our driver for the day, and we've got to get our food. He opens up his wallet, and he pays. He gets back to the room and says, all right. He talks to his wife and says, well, let's see how much money we have left. And he opens up his wallet, and he counts out $2,600. He's already paid for the building. He's already paid for the drivers. He's already paid for the food for the day. His jaw drops. It's like, this happened last year, by the way. This isn't a story from back in the early 1900s or the 1800s when we typically read about miracles. This happened just last year. Comes to the next day. They go through the meetings. There's a huge crowd at these meetings. The pastor of the church actually brought some of his congregation because they got interested in what they had heard. And so he brought people, and they started inviting some more people in town. And a lot of people showed up to these meetings. And he preached the gospel again. They went back home that next day. They paid for their hotel. They paid for their driver. They paid for everything. They counted their money. Do you know how much money they had left up? $2,600. And again, every single night of this meeting, this repeats. And this repeats again and again and again. And every time they open up their wallet and they count at the end of the day, and they have the same amount of money they started with. The meetings are over. They had baptisms. People professed their faith in Jesus, and the church grew, and they were excited, ready to come back home. Because after a mission trip, even though God's working, you're ready to get back home. And they get back home, or they get back, and they're on the airport, getting ready to fly back to their states. They paid for their food. They paid for their things. They get on the plane. They start counting their wallet. They want to count their money. They want to just see how much God's still working. Well, and the money they pay for dinner is now gone, and the money starts dwindling down from there. Like, well, I guess it's not a magical wallet after all. But God provided when they needed it for the sake of his kingdom. But it wasn't until Peter stepped out in faith and paid that money to secure the building where they were doing the meetings at. The biblical Peter was able to walk on water once he stepped out in faith in God. Back in Daniel chapter 2, it was when Daniel sat there and said, hold on, wait. Before you kill all of us, let us pray about this. He stepped out in faith and told the king to wait. It was in Daniel chapter 3 when the three Hebrew boys came before the king and said, hey, listen, we're not going to bow down to you. We're going to step out in faith, and even if our God doesn't save us, we're going to trust him. And over and over and over again was the character of Daniel. You see, in order to understand the prophecies that we're going to start getting into next week in Daniel 7, Daniel 8, 9, 10, and going through and understanding these prophecies, in order to understand what's going on, we have to understand the character that we're talking about, because Daniel saw it important to tell the first half of his book, the stories of his life and what happened with him and his friends and his faithfulness to God. Because the events of chapter 7 actually happen before the events of chapter 5. He doesn't put them in chronological order. But He wants us to understand what it truly means to follow God. And it means taking that step when you don't see the next step. It's nerve-wracking to do that. You know, if I'm sitting here and I'm about ready to come down here, I look down to see where I'm stepping to make sure I don't fall off because I'm clumsy and I fall pretty easily. I have fallen going upstairs and I've fallen going downstairs. I've fallen walking on plain rock. In fact, camp meeting 2 years ago, I end up spraining my ankle and tearing a ligament in my foot by walking. I'm pretty clumsy, so I have to look at where I'm going before I step into something. Sometimes God asks us to step without knowing what the next thing is going to be, if there's going to be a sure footing for us to stand on. And we see that throughout the life of Daniel. And so we see at the beginning of the story, Daniel has already risen back up to a position of leadership, right? We saw that in Nebuchadnezzar's reign, that Daniel had distinguished himself as being somebody who was trustworthy. Not only someone that stood for God, but he excelled in the schooling of the Babylonians. He excelled in all things that he did, not just in his spiritual life. He excelled at everything. The tennis ball was important, so was the golf balls, and so was the beans in Daniel's life. That was a great illustration, by the way, Matthew. He excelled in all these different areas. He was seen as an excellent worker, a great businessman, a great government official. Well, he kind of died down in the limelight in the years of Belshazzar's reign, getting toward the end of Daniel's life. And we see he was elevated back up. Belshazzar, his last act as king before he was killed, was to promote Daniel to the third in the kingdom. And I guess when he died, that eliminated the second, so that kind of put Daniel right back up in the second part of the kingdom. But he proved himself in the new reign of Darius during the time frame of Cyrus. Cyrus is known as a king who was actually a fairly lenient one. He allowed the peoples of the nations he conquered to continue in their worship services. He let them keep on their temple services, and he supported them. Daniel made it up very quickly in the ranks and was set over a third of the people. So there was all the strays that was under him, and then there was the three leaders, him and two other ones. But Daniel was different. He was one of those exiles. One of those dirty people from Judah. Because every time they say it, you can almost read the contempt when you read the words when they say these things. But notice what it says in verse 5. When they were trying to find some problems with him, they said, then these men said, these are the people that's trying to find a fault with him, we shall not find any charge against Daniel unless it is against him concerning the law of God. So that tells us something about Daniel's character. Not only was he true to God, but he was a good worker. He did well in his studies as a student way back when he was just 17 years old. He did well as an administrator. They called the IRS and said, hey, come audit this guy. We got to find some problems with this guy because this guy has got to get out of here. He's got to have some kind of faults. They go over the books. I don't see a number wrong. Okay? Now, I don't know if there were actually books and he did any accounting kind of stuff. Accounting's difficult. I'm not very friendly with accounting. Paul, bless you for having the knack for those numbers because I can't do that. Carol and David for the church. For people who have the knack for those numbers, I don't get that. But his books were immaculate. Not a single problem. I actually pictured Daniel being like a former treasurer that I worked with. He's a friend of mine. And he would go back, if there was just one penny off in his books, he would go back and comb the books until he found where that one penny was missing or where that extra penny had come from. He was very, very meticulous in that kind of thing. Right? Daniel's books were perfect. They couldn't find any fault. They went to, like, well, let's find the complaint line. Let's go and see how many people have filed a complaint against this Daniel guy. And they went down there and they looked to the office and they tried to sit there and say, well, how many people have complained about Daniel? And it's like, well, let me look in the A, B, C, D. Okay, Daniel, his file's empty. They couldn't find a fault with him. We can learn from the life of Daniel that it pays to be a good worker. It pays to be an honest worker in our business. Pays us to be an honest person when dealing with people who are not in the church. Also, when dealing with our brothers and sisters in the church. It's good business to do good business. And so Daniel has this ability to take care of things. He said, we can't find anything wrong with this guy. Nothing, nada. He's good. We can learn from Daniel's character. And they said, well, let's come after him about his God because he's faithful in that too. Is your witness strong enough that if somebody was trying to find a fault with you, they're not going to find any fault with your work because your work is the way it should be. You're not cutting corners. You're doing what's right. So it's like, well, you know what? This person is faithful. Let's come after them because of their religion. As we're going to see as we get into the study of Revelation, I believe that's going to happen again. God's people, people in the world should not be able to find fault with God's people. Unfortunately, in the day we live in today, a lot of people find fault with God's people. But so much so that they won't be able to find fault in the things that we do, that they're going to have to find fault in our faithfulness to God. Are we going to be men and women of character whose only fault is that we follow God the way God has called us to follow Him? They come up to the king, they try to butter the king up and say, oh, king, live forever. That title of respect that we talked about back in Daniel chapter 2. It was like one of those things like, hey, why don't you make one of these laws? You know, we can't change our laws. That's the way our culture works. Once we have a law, we can't just, find a loophole around the law. We like loopholes around the law. It's like, well, technically, that's the word that we use today. Technically, there was no loopholes to laws. When the law was written, the law was done, right? And they said, well, let's write a law that since you're fairly new in power here, and there's some religious turmoil and all this thing, and the whole last Babylonian thing, they did some bad stuff with their religious stuff. Let's make it where we kind of unify our religions. Because there had to be something going on here, because this was actually a tolerant government to other religions. For them to sit there and say 30 days of no tolerance, that you can only pray to me as an individual, or me as a representation of God on earth, which is what the ancients typically believed about their kings. Can't pray to anybody else. Kind of like, hey, yeah, that's a good idea. Y'all can't pray to anybody but me. But he wasn't thinking about Daniel. He kind of just made this on the spur. Sure, I'll sign that. Kind of reminds you of David. Remember when Nathan came to David and said, hey, there's this case about this guy who has his sheep. And another rich guy comes and takes this sheep and slaughters the sheep, even though he had tons of sheep. And what was David's response? His gut response was, kill that man. And then, of course, we know what happened then is that man is you. It's like, oh. Kings kind of have that instance to make those impulsive decisions. And so he makes the impulsive decision. And now when Daniel knew, verse 10, that the writing was signed, he heard that this decree, it was posted on Facebook, everybody saw that, it was put in the paper, it was, the first thing on Google headlines or whatnot, it was out there, he knew about it, and he's like, well, I'm not going to change my routine. The same way with the Hebrew worthies, whenever the statue went up, they didn't bend down to start tying their sandals or whatever they had in those days. They didn't bend down and pretend that they were worshiping. They didn't kneel down and just start praying to God instead of the idol. No, they stood up because they weren't going to compromise their beliefs. Daniel could have just said, okay, let's take these windows and shut these windows. I don't know if he had those French-style windows or whatnot, but I just envisioned him kind of, he could just come up and shut the windows. But no, he left them open, he kneeled down, and he prayed toward Jerusalem the way that he had his entire life. It says, as was his custom. My question is, what is our custom? What is our habits? Do we have the habit of praying every morning? Do we have the habit of praying at night? Do we have the habit of stopping in the middle of our day and spending time in prayer? I think that's important. I mean, we think about it. Most of us, I would hope, at least start off the morning with some sort of prayer. If nothing of God, please help me to wake up, amen. Something, hopefully some kind of acknowledgement of God. Now, I hope your prayer is a little bit more than just praying that God will wake you up or make it through your day. Hopefully you're spending meaningful time with God in the morning. Hopefully you're spending meaningful time with Him in the evening. But Daniel even stopped in the middle of his day to have that meaningful time in the middle of the day. As was his habit. Darius said when he was getting ready to throw him into the pit of Daniels multiple times, you who continually serve your God. You see, here's the thing about Daniel, that if you don't get anything out of everything that I've been saying that myself and the other elders have been saying for the past several weeks, is you get this about Daniel. Daniel was consistent in his relationship with God, and others noticed it. If you're in an environment where you're not around Christians all the time, Daniel, in an environment that everybody was actually completely opposite of what his belief was. Do people in your work, in your school, in your social circles know that you're a Christian? It's interesting. I was reading an article the other day, and this guy sits there and posts in the article, or it was a response to the article, and it was talking about, is your Christian witness effective? And he sits there and says, I've been living in the same house for 30 years. No one around me knows I'm a Christian. He said this proudly. No one knows that I'm a Christian for 30 years. Well, I would venture a guess if no one knows that you're a Christian, that would make me question whether or not you really were one. Because your life should reflect that of what you say, what your profession is. He continues on. Daniel sits there and says that when he went home in his upper room with his window open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God. Not only did he do what he normally did, he did what he normally did. He started his prayer time out with giving God thanks. If at any point in time you can say, God, whoa, I need your help, would be when there's a death decree and a threatening to throw you to the lions. But he still starts off his prayer by thanking God for what he has been given. Daniel's an old man. And I've said this before, Daniel was in his late 80s, probably early 90s, when he was thrown into the den of lions. He wasn't a spring chicken anymore. He was an old man. But during his whole life, he had always put God first. Then the men assembled found Daniel praying. Of course they found him praying. They knew he would. That was his custom. And they went to Darius and said, oh, Darius, live forever, king. Didn't you say? How many times have you had somebody throw words back in your safe? Well, you said. Yeah, I did. And you kind of regret those words that ever came out of your mouth? Well, Darius is like, man, I guess I did. And Darius even tried to, until sunset that day, which is when the law was supposed to be enacted, he tried to find ways to get out of his own law. He scurried the ways, but he couldn't. And they reminded him, oh, Darius, king, live forever. You can't do that. It's your law. You wrote it, or at least you signed it. Maybe we should read what we signed. I don't know. Have you ever seen those agreements and it's like 14 pages and you just kind of scroll to the bottom and hit accept? Kind of the way that Darius did here. It's like, oh, I don't need to read all that. Hopefully nothing bad happens, accept. And then Darius says something. And this is something that I hope that people can say about us. Your God, whom you serve continually. Verse 16. He will deliver you. You got to remember that this Darius was not the pastor of Daniel's local church, trying to give encouragement to his church members. This guy was not his best friend who he had gone to school with since a boy and came up with. No. This was a man that didn't really know Daniel very well. At least he didn't know him very long. And he sits there and says, your God, he will deliver you. Do our lives make an impact on people around us in that way? Or somebody that we don't know very well, or somebody, maybe it's a new teacher, maybe it's a new employer, maybe it's a new person that you're working with on a council, or maybe it's a new whatever. Would they come up to you and say that your God will deliver you? You see, Daniel's faith was so contagious and so real in God that his belief in his God made others believe in his belief of his God. Are you following me? This is the faith of Daniel. And if we don't get the faith of Daniel, we're not going to understand any of the prophecies in Daniel. We have to understand his faith to understand the prophecies that God gave through him. Daniel was in the community as much as anyone can be in the community. He compromised in every way that he could compromise. And it's only recorded very few times that he didn't compromise. But when he didn't compromise, it was because of God. And he always put God first. Verse 20. Daniel, servant of the living God. Notice how he used that word living. Not the dead God. Not the God that you serve. Not did this, that. The living God. His example had already been shown that it was the living God who would save him. Whom you serve continually. Been able to deliver you from the lions. I mean, I can picture this in my mind. He's there. He cuts the bands or knocks off whatever shows that it was sealed. You know, in my mind, I kind of go to when you go to staying in a hotel and it's got that little seal around the toilet showing you that nobody's messed with it yet. I mean, I know that's not what he had on there, but that's kind of what I picture in my mind's eye. He broke the seal. And he's told the guards to roll away the stone. Daniel. And I just envisioned Daniel like, oh, hey, it's about time he came. God, it's time for your power to be shown. O King, live forever. Daniel still used the term of courtesy and respect within that culture. He still gave respect and honor due to the man that had him thrown into a den of lions. He still recognized the authority of this man. Even though that man had no authority over religious things, he still showed honor and respect to this guy. O King, live forever. My God sent his angel to shut the mouths of lions, that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O King, still using the title of respect, I have done nothing wrong before you. Now the king was excitingly glad. Can you imagine? He knew that God could save him, but there was still this seed of doubt in his mind. Daniel, was your God able to save you? That guy that you served so passionately and so faithfully, was he able to save you? And Daniel said, oh, yes, he was. Oh, yes, he was. And then Darius, like Nebuchadnezzar before him, puts out his own decree, a new decree, of course, being very similar to that of Nebuchadnezzar's, being a pretty forceful decree. To all the people, nations, and languages that dwell on all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. Okay, that was kind of the Persian thing. Nebuchadnezzar didn't write that. That was kind of a Persian thing because they were known as being more generous rulers. Goodness, words will come out of my mouth shortly. I make a decree that in every dominion in my kingdom men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one that shall not be destroyed. Very interesting, he refers back to the prophecy of Daniel chapter 2. It is his kingdom that you've heard of. That is that rock that was cut out without hands, that smashed all the kingdoms, including our kingdom, to pieces. It is his kingdom which shall not be destroyed. His dominion shall endure till the end. He's quoting the prophecy of Daniel 2. He knew of it. He delivers and rescues and works in signs and wonders in heaven and earth. Who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions? God did not protect Daniel from going into the lion's den. God did not protect Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from going into the fiery furnace. He did not protect Joseph from going into slavery and then going into prison. He's not always going to protect us in every situation. God will allow things to happen to us, not necessarily to even prove our faithfulness to him. Do you think Daniel needed to prove to God that he was faithful at this point in his life? Absolutely not. He had been showing that he was faithful since he was a young boy. There was no need for God to test him in this. God didn't need to test him because he knew he would ace it. He gave the test so others could see his glory. God can and will test us to make sure that we're following him. But even if we are fully faithful in following him, he will still test us to prove that he is the God to other people. So maybe you're going through that trial right now. Maybe you're going through that test right now. Maybe you're going through something where you're like, God, haven't I already given you enough? Haven't I already showed you time and time again that I'm serving you, that I'm following you? Haven't I done this over and over and over again? And then God whispers in your ear, my child, yes, you have. This is not you that I'm testing. I'm using you because I know how you tested. And I want to show the world around you who I am. Are you willing to be tried like Daniel? Are you willing to be a Daniel in a society that's full of the governors and is full of the principalities that wish to do you harm? Will you dare to be a Daniel when you live in a world that even the mention of being a follower of God is like, psh, you poor, poor soul? Next week, we'll start into the actual prophecies of Daniel, Daniel chapter 7. And we're going to be looking at these prophecies, not just as prophecies that tells the future. We're going to be studying that more on the Wednesday nights afterwards. But we're going to be looking at how does Jesus represent himself in these passages? How can we be more like Daniel in our everyday life? How can we be follow more closely to God in everything that we do? My challenge you to this morning is pretty simple. Put God first, always in your life. And let your witness to those around you be one that honors him. And if you are going through a trial, don't ask God, why are you trying me? I've already proven myself. Say, God, thank you for the opportunity to prove who you are. Let us pray. Father in heaven, you are good. You are good. Thank you so much for being the God of the universe. Thank you for sending your son Jesus to die on the cross. Thank you for giving your servant Daniel the faith and courage to stand before rulers and kings. And I pray that you give that same power to us. You are good, God. We thank you in the name of your son Jesus.